My name is Carol Frost, and I'm an assistant professor here in the Department of Renewable Resources at the University of Alberta. I study arthropod community ecology, which includes insects, and actually, my students and I do a lot of research on pollinators. So this is an interesting question. Do pollinators only like specific species of plants? This is interesting because when we try to think about conserving pollinators or restoring land for pollinators, we have to know what pollinators like to visit, what plants they like to use, what flowers they find have tasty nectar and pollen. Historically, in the study of plant-pollinator interactions, scientists and biologists had this view that the interaction between a plant and a pollinator is very specific, and it's kind of like a lock and key, where the flower is the lock and the pollinator's mouth parts are the key, and there's got to be a perfect fit between those mouth parts and that flower corolla. And so biologists sort of thought that in general, plant-pollinator interactions were very specialized, and pollinators only liked certain species of flower. However, in the past several decades, we've seen a lot more research that looks at the entire community of flowers and what's visiting them. So for example, standardized observations across a whole field of flowers and catching the insects to identify them and see what insects are visiting what flowers. And this research has actually shown that most pollinators in an area, in any area that you study, are very generalist. And that means that they will visit many different kinds of flowers. And it depends more than on what the flower is, on how recently it's flowered and how much nectar it's got. And it also might depend on what other pollinators are visiting it. For example, many pollinators are actually kind of afraid to visit a flower that already has a very big pollinator on it, like bumblebees are very scary for little bees. So there are many things that affect what pollinators visit what flowers, but for very few species is it actually that a pollinator won't visit a flower because it's the wrong species. However, saying all this, there are some species of pollinator that are very specific about what flowers they'll visit. For example, some bees in the families Andrenidae and Halictidae, so those are the mining bees and the sweat bees, a few species in those families are very specialist. And the scientific word for only liking one or a few kinds of flowers is oligolectic. So oligolectic bees do have these very tight preferences. And the reason why some bees are like this is because they have adaptations to be able to deal with that particular plant's nectar or pollen, and in particular, to process maybe toxic chemicals that are in the pollen or the nectar. And maybe other bees and other pollinators aren't able to do that, such that if they drank the nectar from that flower, it would be unhealthy for them. So bees that have these adaptations to use specific flower species sometimes are very specialized on them. And the part of the world that has a lot of oligolectic bees in particular is desert regions. For some reason, you find way more very specialized bees in desert regions than in other parts of the world. Here where we are at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, we have very many very generalist pollinator species, not just bees, but the other kinds of pollinating insects too, like flies and beetles and butterflies. In our research, we have found the same species of those things visiting many different kinds of flowers.